Well, I definitely want to make sure everybody can hear what we're going to talk about today because it is such an important topic. Kind of a frame for the presentation today is what was happening around the time that we were working on the proposal for this presentation. That was the time, I don't know if any of you have heard of 13 Reasons Why. Right. So that was coming out, and there were a lot of issues happening with young people who were suddenly talking about suicide or maybe even making plans for suicide. That kind of happened as a wave in response to that. Now, that's not to say that youth suicides didn't happen before that event, but I think that really triggered some awareness in my mind that, you know, this problem is becoming more pertinent to people who are working with adolescents, and especially school counselors. And although I myself am a mental health counselor and work with students at the university level, I do feel that a lot of what I do is really applicable to anybody working in a school setting, anybody who's working with students and working with young people. So we're going to try to make this as useful for all of you as we can today and get a sense of where all of you are coming from. But first, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Maria Lammy. So I'm a PhD student in counselor education at Ohio State. And I've been working for about 3 years as a student leadership development coordinator, I guess, as a graduate associate at the suicide prevention program. I'm also a licensed professional mental health counselor. So what about all of you? Could you raise your hand if you're a school counselor? All right, I figured we'd have a lot of you. And anybody who is a mental health counselor here today? Okay. Anybody working on a college setting? Okay, a couple. High school setting? Okay. Middle school? How about elementary school? Got any? Or younger? Okay. Well, I'm glad there's a wide variety, and we've tried to include a lot in this presentation that's going to be applicable regardless of where you're working. So primarily, the majority of this presentation is going to give you 2 cases of different student groups that I've worked with and advised during my time at OSU. And we've given you a handout that we hope you can take some notes on, because after we talk about these case studies, I guess, we're going to go into some implications for school counselors and developmentally appropriate ways to talk about suicide or work with suicide prevention with younger individuals as well. Yes? I think we've run out of handouts. I'm sorry about that, but if you did not get a handout, please talk to us at the end and we'll give you a card with an email and we'll be happy to email that over to you. In addition to that, it is great if you're able to take some notes, because if we have time at the end, we really want to open this up for a discussion so that everybody in the room who has questions or who is really trying to think about how do I implement this in my workplace, in my job, will be able to have that discussion. We'd be happy to answer questions, and maybe some of you as well have some answers to those questions. Okay, Gail's going to run you through the handout real quick before we get going.
Okay, so this will be helpful for the people that don't have the handout too. So the handout goes over 3 different boxes. One is peer involvement, parental involvement, and school involvement. So the peer involvement, these are the 3 things that we will be going over.
Who's already working with students around the topic of suicide prevention? Okay, a couple of you. Anybody want to shout out some of what you already do with students, how they're involved?
We have a group called SOS, it's supporting our students. It's a student-led group that focuses on mental health awareness and just promoting some healthy choices.
Yeah, and that's perfect. I think that's going to tie nicely with some of what I'm going to talk about too. Yeah.
We partner with Nationwide with a program also called SOS, but it's signs of suicide, and it's more for peers to see the warning signs in your classmates and in your friends.
Okay.
And then it culminates, it's a 2-day thing for the students, and then it culminates with the BSAT, basically suicide assessment for everybody.
Okay, yeah, so for everybody who didn't hear, that's Signs of Suicide, which is a 2-day kind of workshop, would you say, where they learn about how to recognize warning signs and what to respond. And then another person mentioned doing SOS, supporting our students, which is more of an interest group around mental health and those kinds of things. Anyone else want to share something different? Okay, well, I think that's great, because a big part of what I'm going to talk about is student groups and how that can be a really effective tool, so we'll talk more about that. Now, just to make sure we get the facts out there, suicide is the second leading cause of death for both college-age students and people in adolescence. And on average, from the Jason Foundation, over 3,400 students attempt suicide per day. And so that would be medically, suicide attempts that need to be medically treated where the student or the young person admits that they did have the intention of taking their life. So it is a big problem and something that I think all of us will encounter in one way or another in our work. And I do want to reference the Jason Foundation. Who's heard of that before? Okay, so if you haven't heard of the Jason Foundation, it's jasonfoundation.com. Great resources for youth, suicide, and all kinds of resources and statistics are listed on that website. But since we're going to not just talk about suicide, but talk about suicide prevention today, it's really important to know that some of the statistics we get about suicide, although those numbers are quite high, it's actually an even bigger problem when we expand that out to attempts or to people considering suicide. So between the ages of 15 to 54, it's averaged that about 117 people die each day by suicide. So if we take that number of 100, we expand it out, that's over 4,500 attempts a day, and then 25,000 people seriously considering suicide. So we don't want to wait until it gets to that moment of suicide or even that attempt of suicide, but what can we do to be proactive and what can we do to be preventative? And I think that a big part of it is stigma that exists in the environment, people not knowing how to talk about it or how to come out and who to talk to that's going to be a safe person to talk to. And since a lot of you are school counselors, you probably are someone that hopefully they view as a safe person to talk to about this. But even then, we've done this study. This is from Ohio State Center for the Study of Student Life. It shows that a lot of students will turn to a close friend before they turn to anybody else when they're struggling with a problem. So that became part of the motivation for why we wanted to get students involved, why we wanted to do peer-led initiatives where students were actually becoming endowed with a certain responsibility for going out and advocating in the community and taking action. And part of that effort has been to create a campus culture of caring. That's actually the slogan we use for our student groups, so they will always be posting #culture of caring on their social media projects and all of that. But it's become a really great slogan because it reminds them that when we're at meetings or when we're out at events or when we're doing these different projects, we're emphasizing really strong connections to others. So there are opportunities built into the student groups where they actually get a chance to talk about some of what motivates them and what draws them into this mental health interest. And I think that's just one way that it becomes a topic that's safe to talk about with their peers. And of course, if somebody talks about it with their peers, and then everybody in the group knows that, this is such a sensitive topic that you don't keep those kinds of secrets, I think Gail will talk more about that later, then it can come back to you as the advisor or as the counselor, as the person who's working with these students, that if they share that with a peer, that information might come to your ears next. Also, a community that supports help seeking. So I think this is getting better with the younger generation, but I mean, traditionally there might have been a lot of stigma around going in for mental health treatment. And I have heard some students say that when they've had to leave school for, extended periods of time to get help for mental health related issues, that they can feel very stigmatized coming back. So we want to transform that environment so that if students are getting help for their needs, it won't be so stigmatizing for them, right? So I'm going to talk about two student organizations that I advise. They're very different groups. The first is called Peers Reaching Out. Has anyone heard of the REACH program? Okay. How about QPR? Anybody heard of QPR? Okay. So QPR is a more popular, widespread suicide prevention gatekeeper training, but we have our own in-house made version of that called REACH. And basically the point of a gatekeeper training is that the people who are in the audience will learn those warning signs, they'll learn what steps they need to take to respond, they're going to learn all the resources available to them in that community. So we use REACH as one way to train about suicide prevention. But we had traditionally only done this with staff, and we wanted to kind of make sure that that training is appropriately presented. It's a very sensitive topic. You don't want to take any risks when you're talking about an issue like suicide. It has to be done really well. And so PROS was our first effort to create peer educators related to suicide prevention. Something pretty unique. It's not being done at a lot of other places. And with BACA Campaign Against Suicide, I think might be a little bit more relatable at that high school level, and I think maybe even similar to SOS, as you have described it, that it's more of a student interest group. It was organically created by students, and is much more open membership, free-flowing structure, and all of that. So I'm going to compare them, and I know that a lot of what I'm going to talk about, you're going to feel like this is never something that I could pull off with my budget or with my resources or at my setting, but I hope that there are at least elements of that that you're thinking you could take those bits away. You can make those notes on your handout as well, or on your piece of paper, just to get your gears turning, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about maybe how this translates into a school setting, or what other considerations, and we'll have that discussion at the end where we can talk more about that.